Blood pressure can drift for years without pain. The numbers change slowly, often quietly, long before symptoms appear. By the time attention is drawn to it, the reading itself has already shaped how blood reaches the brain, the heart, and the kidneys. My name is Dr. Warren Hung. I'm a medical doctor, and on this channel, we care health. My work focuses on prevention and long-term function. I spend much of my time explaining common medical numbers that are treated as simple targets, even though the body behind them is anything but simple. One of the most common questions I hear from people over 60 sounds straightforward. What should my blood pressure be now? It is usually followed by another sentence. I was told it needs to be under a certain number. That expectation did not come from nowhere. For decades, blood pressure has been taught as a single cutoff. Above it is danger. Below it is safety. This framing is easy to remember, easy to print on charts, and easy to repeat in short appointments. But it hides something important. Blood pressure is not just a risk score. It is a force that keeps blood moving through aging vessels. As the body changes with time, the meaning of the same number can change as well. After 60, arteries are no longer the same structures they were at 30 or 40. They stiffen. They lose recoil. They transmit pressure differently with each heartbeat. A reading that looks too high on paper may sometimes be maintaining flow. A reading pushed lower may sometimes reduce it. This is where many people get confused. They assume the goal is to chase the lowest safe number. They assume lower always means better. They assume the same target applies to every older adult, regardless of health, history, or symptoms. This is not how clinicians think when we slow down and look at physiology. In real medicine, the question is rarely, is this number low enough? The real question is, does this pressure support the organs it is meant to supply without causing damage over time? The reason this topic matters is not because blood pressure causes problems overnight. It matters because small mismatches between pressure and circulation accumulate quietly. They affect balance. They affect thinking speed. They affect kidney filtration. They affect how the heart adapts year after year. In this video, I will answer a very specific question. What is the best blood pressure after 60? And why do so many people get this wrong? To answer it properly, we first need to step back. Before we talk about aging, targets, or guidelines, we need to understand what blood pressure is supposed to do when the system is working well. But before we can decide what numbers make sense later in life, we need to understand how blood pressure works in a body before age changes the vessels it flows through. Before blood pressure becomes a problem, it is simply a function. It is the force that keeps blood moving forward with each heartbeat. Without enough of that force, organs do not receive oxygen or nutrients at the right pace. Each heartbeat has two main phases. The first is the squeeze. The heart contracts and pushes blood into the arteries. The pressure measured at that moment is called systolic pressure. It reflects how much force is needed to move blood into the arterial system. The second phase happens between beats. The heart relaxes. During this pause, blood still needs to keep moving. That continued flow depends on the arteries themselves. The pressure measured during this resting phase is called diastolic pressure. To understand this, picture the arteries not as rigid pipes, but as flexible tubes. In a younger or healthier system, artery walls stretch slightly when blood is pushed in. They store part of that energy. Then, between beats, they recoil and help push blood forward. This recoil is not optional. It smooths blood flow. It protects small vessels. It keeps pressure from dropping too low when the heart relaxes. So blood pressure is not just about the heart. It is a partnership between the heart's pumping force and the artery's ability to stretch and spring back. When arteries are flexible, systolic pressure does not need to be very high to move blood forward. The vessels accept the blood easily. Diastolic pressure stays stable because recoil supports flow between beats. This balance is why younger adults often have a narrower gap between the top and bottom numbers. That gap is called pulse pressure. It is simply systolic minus diastolic pressure. In a healthy elastic system, that gap stays modest. Blood pressure also responds moment to moment. When you stand up, pressure shifts. When you walk, it adjusts. When you rest, it settles. The nervous system, kidneys, and blood vessels all work together to keep flow steady without conscious effort. The kidneys play a quiet role here. They sense pressure and adjust fluid balance over days and weeks. Too much pressure, and they release fluid. Too little, and they conserve it. This is part of how blood pressure stays within a usable range. Importantly, in this earlier stage of life, lower pressure usually does mean lower risk. Flexible arteries tolerate lower numbers well. Organs still receive blood efficiently. Symptoms are rare unless pressure drops suddenly. This is where many simplified rules come from. Large population studies in middle-aged adults showed that lower average pressures were associated with fewer strokes and heart attacks. Those findings shaped guidelines and public messaging for decades. But those studies were largely based on people whose arteries could still adapt. Their vessels could cushion pressure changes. Their brains and kidneys were not yet dependent on higher driving pressure to maintain flow. Nothing in this system is about hitting a perfect number. It is about maintaining enough pressure to overcome resistance while avoiding excess strain on vessel walls. As long as arteries stretch and recoil properly, this balance is forgiving. The system compensates. Small deviations are corrected without consequence. This is why blood pressure targets make sense only when you understand the system underneath them. Numbers are not independent goals. They are reflections of how well pressure, flow, and resistance are working together. The problem begins when the system itself changes, but the targets do not. After 60, the heart may still pump well, but the arteries no longer behave the same way. They respond differently to the same pressure. And that is where the meaning of normal starts to shift. But once artery walls lose their ability to stretch and recoil, the same blood pressure numbers no longer mean the same thing for blood flow. As the body ages, arteries change, even if no disease is diagnosed. This change is gradual. It does not announce itself with pain or warning signs. But it alters how blood pressure readings should be understood. Arteries are living tissue. Over decades, their walls lose elastic fibers and gain stiffer material. Calcium can deposit in the wall. Collagen replaces elastin. The vessel becomes less able to stretch when blood is pushed into it. This stiffness changes the first number on the blood pressure reading. When arteries cannot stretch easily, the heart has to push harder to move the same amount of blood forward. That raises systolic pressure, even if the heart itself is healthy. At the same time, stiff arteries recoil poorly between beats. That recoil is what normally helps maintain diastolic pressure. When recoil is reduced, diastolic pressure often falls. This creates a wider gap between the two numbers. Systolic goes up, diastolic goes down. Pulse pressure widens. This pattern is common after 60. It is called isolated systolic hypertension, meaning the top number is high while the bottom number is normal or low. It reflects vessel stiffness more than overactive pumping. This matters because organs do not feel numbers. They feel flow. Blood reaches tissue because pressure is high enough to overcome resistance in small vessels. The brain is especially sensitive to this balance. It sits higher than the heart and depends on steady pressure to maintain blood flow. If systolic pressure drops too much in a stiff arterial system, brain perfusion can fall. That can lead to lightheadedness, slower thinking, or unsteadiness, especially when standing. The kidneys are also pressure dependent. They filter blood through tiny structures that rely on a certain pressure range. If pressure is lowered aggressively in someone with stiff arteries, filtration can decline even if lab numbers look acceptable at first. This is where confusion often begins. A blood pressure reading may look better on paper, but the organs downstream may be receiving less blood than before. It is also why symptoms matter more with age. A younger person can tolerate a drop in pressure without noticing. An older person with stiff arteries may feel it immediately. Large observational studies have shown that very low diastolic pressure in older adults is associated with higher risk of falls, kidney injury, and cognitive decline. For example, analyses from cohorts like the Framingham Heart Study have shown that low diastolic pressure combined with high systolic pressure predicts vascular risk differently than in younger adults. This does not mean high blood pressure is harmless. High systolic pressure still damages vessel walls over time and raises stroke risk. But it does mean the margin for error is narrower. Lowering blood pressure after 60 is not about pushing numbers down at all cost. It is about finding a range that reduces long-term damage without starving organs of flow. Artery stiffness also explains why one-size targets fail. Two people can have the same reading and very different circulation. One may tolerate lower pressure well, the other may not. This is why modern guidelines increasingly emphasize individualized targets, especially in older adults with symptoms, frailty, or multiple conditions. The key point is simple. After 60, blood pressure numbers reflect vessel aging as much as disease. Ignoring that leads to overtreatment in some and undertreatment in others. But once you understand how aging changes what blood pressure represents, the question becomes practical. What numbers actually make sense to aim for after 60? This is the point where most people expect a single number. They expect a cutoff that separates safe from unsafe. That expectation is exactly where the misunderstanding begins. There is no single best blood pressure for every person over 60. There are ranges that balance risk and function, and those ranges depend on how stiff the arteries are, how symptoms respond, and what organs need to be protected. To explain this clearly, we need to separate what guidelines say, what physiology supports, and why those two are often confused. Let's start with what major guidelines actually recommend. For many years, targets for older adults were more relaxed. Guidelines from groups like the American College of Cardiology and American Heart Association allowed systolic pressures up to 150 millimeters Hg in adults over 60, especially if lowering further caused symptoms. That changed after trials such as SPRINT. SPRINT compared more intensive systolic lowering, target under 120, with standard targets under 140 in high-risk adults. The study showed fewer cardiovascular events in the lower target group. But there is an important detail that is often skipped. SPRINT excluded people with diabetes, prior stroke, advanced kidney disease, and many frail seniors. Blood pressure was measured in controlled settings, often lower than routine clinic readings. Falls and symptoms increased in some participants. So what does that mean in real clinical practice? Most modern guidelines now suggest this general framework for adults over 60. Systolic pressure. Often reasonable to aim for 130-140 mmHg if tolerated. Up to 150 mm may be acceptable in older or more fragile individuals. Diastolic pressure. Generally best kept above 60-65 mmHg to support organ perfusion. These are not slogans. They are working ranges. Now let's address why. Most get this wrong. The first mistake is treating systolic pressure alone as the goal. People focus on lowering the top number without watching what happens to the bottom number. If systolic drops from 150 to 125, but diastolic falls from 70 to 55, blood flow to the brain and kidneys may worsen, not improve. The second mistake is assuming lower always means safer. Lower systolic pressure does reduce long-term stroke risk in many people. But in older adults with stiff arteries, very low pressure can reduce perfusion during daily activities, especially when standing or walking. The third mistake is ignoring symptoms. Dizziness, fatigue, slowed thinking, or near falls are not normal aging. They are often signals that pressure has dropped below what that individual's circulation can support. So what does best mean in clinical terms? It means the lowest pressure that reduces long-term vascular damage, maintains steady blood flow to the brain, heart, and kidneys, does not cause dizziness, falls, or functional decline. That balance point differs between people. For a healthy, active, 6'2" with elastic arteries, a systolic pressure in the low 130s may be appropriate and well tolerated. For an 2-year-old with stiff arteries and a history of falls, a systolic pressure around 140 to 150 may be safer and more functional. This is why single number advice fails. It ignores pulse pressure. It ignores symptoms. It ignores how aging vessels change the meaning of the same reading. Another common misunderstanding is thinking blood pressure treatment is about fixing the number. In reality, it is about managing risk over years while preserving daily function. When clinicians say a pressure is controlled, they are not saying it is perfect. They are saying it is doing its job without causing harm. The best blood pressure after 60 is not the lowest achievable number. It is the number that supports circulation today while reducing damage tomorrow. That is the part most people are never told. But understanding the right range is only half the picture, because pushing blood pressure too low in later life carries risks that are often missed until something goes wrong. Lowering blood pressure always sounds protective. It feels logical. Less pressure should mean less damage. But after 60, that logic can break down. Blood pressure has one primary job. It must push blood through small vessels that resist flow. When pressure drops below what those vessels require, organs are supplied less reliably, even if the numbers look good. One of the first systems affected is balance control. When an older adult stands up, gravity pulls blood toward the legs. The body normally compensates by tightening vessels and raising pressure slightly. If baseline pressure is already low, that compensation may not be enough. This is why dizziness on standing becomes common when pressure is pushed too far down. It is not weakness. It is insufficient driving pressure to the brain for a few critical seconds. Falls are not random events. Large cohort studies have consistently shown that aggressive blood pressure lowering in older adults increases fall risk, especially when diastolic pressure drops below about 60 millimeters Hg. Falls are not minor outcomes. They are a major cause of hospitalization, loss of independence, and mortality after 65. The brain is also sensitive to sustained low pressure. Cerebral blood flow depends on pressure to overcome resistance in small vessels. In younger adults, vessels adjust easily. In older adults with stiff arteries, that adjustment is limited. Several observational analyses, including data from the Framingham Heart Study, have shown an association between low diastolic pressure and cognitive decline in older populations, particularly when combined with high systolic pressure. The concern is not that blood pressure medications damage the brain. The concern is that pressure falls below the threshold needed for consistent perfusion. The kidneys face a similar problem. They filter blood using pressure across microscopic units called glomeruli. If pressure drops too low, filtration slows. Over time, kidney function can decline even though blood pressure readings look controlled. This is why kidney function sometimes worsens after intensifying blood pressure treatment in older adults. The issue is not toxicity. It is underperfusion. Fatigue is another overlooked signal. When blood flow to muscles and the brain is reduced, energy levels drop. People describe feeling flat, slowed, or less steady. These are often dismissed as aging, but they frequently improve when pressure is adjusted upward slightly. It is important to be precise here. This does not mean blood pressure should be left high out of fear. High systolic pressure still increases stroke and heart failure risk over years. The point is that risk is two-sided. Too high causes damage over time. Too low causes immediate functional problems. Clinical medicine lives in that narrow space between the two. This is why modern care emphasizes monitoring symptoms alongside numbers. A reading that looks ideal on paper but causes dizziness or falls is not ideal. A reading slightly above target that preserves stability and cognition may be safer. Blood pressure treatment after 60 is not a contest to reach the lowest number. It is a balance between protection and perfusion. Ignoring the lower boundary is how harm occurs quietly. But to make sense of these trade-offs, we need to connect all the systems involved and separate number control from long-term preservation. Blood pressure is not an isolated number. It is a shared outcome of the heart, the arteries, the brain, and the kidneys working together. When one part of that system changes with age, the meaning of the number changes with it. After 60, arteries stiffen. That stiffness raises systolic pressure and lowers the margin for error. The brain becomes more dependent on steady pressure to stay perfused. The kidneys rely on enough force to filter blood without strain. This is why the same blood pressure reading can be protective in one person and problematic in another. The number itself does not tell the full story. The response of the body to that number does. In clinical practice, there is a difference between controlling a number and preserving function. Control focuses on meeting a target. Preservation focuses on keeping organs working well over time. Good care after 60 does both. It lowers excessive pressure that damages vessels. It avoids lowering pressure so much that organs are undersupplied. This is also why symptoms matter. Dizziness, falls, confusion, and fatigue are not side effects to ignore. They are feedback from the system saying pressure no longer matches demand. When blood pressure treatment works well, people often feel more stable. not worse. They think clearly. They move confidently. They maintain independence. That outcome rarely comes from chasing the lowest possible number. It comes from choosing a range that fits the person's circulation as it exists now. So when someone asks, what is the best blood pressure after 60? The honest answer is not a slogan. It is this: the best pressure is one that protects vessels and supports daily function, without trading one for the other. That is why most people get this wrong. They are taught to fear the number instead of understand the system. On We Care Health, my goal is not to give you targets to memorize. It is to help you understand why those targets exist and when they need adjustment. Blood pressure management is not about winning against a chart. It is about staying upright, clear-headed, and well-perfused over the long term. That perspective matters more than any single reading.